Okay, Stefan, you got cut off by the break and my gibbering. I was getting into the fact of, because I always bring in another element, about how right as in Europe and the United States and England and Canada, right as people have been paying into these Social Security Ponzi schemes, right as we're supposed to get our pension funds that we've invested, in these private systems, it's all gone in derivatives, and then we get the internal Goldman Sachs emails. They knew all about it. We know it was premeditated, and so they're holding the yuppies hostage, saying, if you want your goodies, you better go along with total government and really raping younger people. Now, will they buy into that? Stefan, how do you see all this coming together?
Well, look, I mean, there is a very strong problem, a huge problem that governments around the world are facing at the moment, which is that they have no money to pay off the Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid bills that are due. And like anybody who's caught with their pants down, who's not a very good person, the first thing that governments are trying to do is to create a scapegoat as to why the money isn't there. And they're going to have a lot of explaining to do, as Ricky Ricardo used to say. They're going to have a lot of explaining to do to the population who have no other options. They've been taxed so heavily. Their savings have been pillaged. Their houses have been devalued. They have nothing, or a lot of people have almost nothing to retire on. I mean, the majority of Americans are literally living pennies to pennies, paycheck to paycheck. They have nothing to retire on. So governments have no money to pay them. And so what are they going to do? Well, they create a crisis, they pillage what's left, and then they can blame the banks, and they can blame capitalism, they can blame freedom, and then they can move in and say, well, we tried giving your retirement money to the stock market, but the stock market pillaged it all, so now we're going to have to take over even more. It really is up to people who've got the economic knowledge and intelligence and hopefully communications abilities to remind people that the problem is not the handshake. The problem is always the gun. The gun in the room is what is always causing the problem. The fact that a government has the monopoly on violence is what is causing all of these problems. The stock market is a completely bizarre and mutated entity relative to its original purpose.
It's totally rigged, and I want you to get into that, and the whole system of government being a gang with a flag and a propaganda corps. But going back, because I want you to quantify this, and I want to quantify my position. Yes, they are using what's happened with the banks as a way to demonize capitalism, but that's free market, free will, moral capitalism, not the crony, fascist, insider capitalism. The predatory capitalism isn't capitalism at all. It's big mega corporations using government to consolidate power. So it's the mega elite on record preparing to scapegoat the middle class, smaller banks, and the free market for what they've done.
Well, that's exactly right. If you think of a neighborhood where there's a big mafia, the mafia goes and takes all of this money by threatening shopkeepers and honest workers. The mafia goes and takes all of this money, and then the mafia spends all this money on different things, catering and parties and sedans or whatever. And so a lot of businesses become dependent upon the mafia's spending habits, and they then, in a sense, work to legitimize the mafia because that's who they've become dependent on for their income. And so what's going to happen is people really only see the businesses. They don't see the government at the root of it. And so the businesses become a convenient scapegoat, though I would not say that all businesses are entirely innocent of collusion with the state. But yeah, it's really important to remember that the money that is collected and printed and manufactured and borrowed by government flows out into the economy, and it creates a lot of, like sharks have those little striped fish that hang around and pick up the bits of fish that they chew. There's a lot of fascistic corporations hanging off the government's money.
Yes, government empowers those fascistic corporations. That's why they're always lobbying to expand it. And out of 100 largest economies, almost half of them are not countries. They're now private corporations. So that's my issue with pure anarchists sometimes, is they see a company as a company when they really operate as a government, and then they create artificial clones of real moves to liberty. They create privatization, but it isn't really privatization. It is a private group now becoming quasi-government.
Well, look, corporations are state entities. It's really important to remember corporations were created in the 19th century to give executives to exclude them from liability for what their company did. And in return for this exclusion of liability, the corporate executives agree to pay taxes, right? So it's a bribe to the government in the form of corporate taxes in return for the exclusion from liability for whatever their companies do. And that's really the fundamentals. There's no such thing as a corporation as we currently understand it now. There would be never any such thing without the government. It is a state-created predatory monster. But it's really, really important to remember that these things would have no power without the violence of the state driving all of this money and all of this power. We have to, in a sense, look past the corruptions of the corporations, which is a mere effect of state power, and look at the root of evil, which is the gun held to the neck of the average citizen to pay taxes, to be a taxed livestock, and to be obedient, to send their kids to school, to submit to authority. It's the gun, not the effects of the gun, that we need to focus on.
Well, I agree with you that if you go back 235 years ago when this country got founded, there were no corporations. And then about 160 years ago, in a few limited cases, government would want to build a bridge or a railroad, and robber barons, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the usual suspects, on record came and said, give us a corporation then for liability protection, and it would only be for the life of the construction project. Now here we are with corporations that have immunity, that have rights that never go away.
Well, yeah, and look, executives get to take the profits out of a corporation, but they don't have to pay losses back into the corporation. It's a one-way money tunnel. And that, of course, is a pretty sweet deal. It's the private equivalent of the Federal Reserve in that you can make money and you get to keep the winnings. But if you lose money, the employees and the taxpayers, the employees and the stockholders are the ones who get shafted. So again, it's really easy to look at corporations because they're more visible and they're what we actually deal with. And corporations, you can also have some small effect on them through boycotts, which you can't have through government. But to me, the problems with corporatism are a distraction from the real cause of it. I think if you think of a sort of stream coming down a river, if somebody's pouring bucket after bucket of pollutant or blood in the top of the stream, then there's going to be all these problems downstream. And we're always distracted by looking at the problems downstream and saying, well, how are we going to clean this? How are we going to fix this? How are we going to make this whole again? But what we have to do is go to the source where somebody's pouring all this pollutant, and that is the state. The corporate problems are an effect of the monopoly of power and currency and counterfeiting that the state holds. And it's really important not to be distracted by the effects of power and continue to drill down to the actual source of all of this, which is the monopoly of force that the government has.
Well, I tend to agree with you. But, I'd like to give you the floor in the last 20 minutes or so that we've got left, Stefan. I mean, I've got some other questions to get your perspective on this. How do you see this ending? Where do you see this going? Clearly in history, governments filled with the type of miscreants who can only be successful within that artificial system go on a power-mad drinking binge, as you described it, literally drinking blood, in one way or the other, sucking off their fellow humans. They always create a stagnation where the average person just stops producing as their ultimate form of protest towards government. Where do you see this ending? Clearly government is entering the depths of insanity right now.
Well, it's only insanity if you're looking for sustainable income for society as a whole. The people who are currently pillaging the treasury are getting millions and billions and sometimes even trillions of dollars, which they can then live on for 10 generations. So it's only insane for society as a whole. It's entirely sane and rational, evil, but rational in terms of self-interest for the people who are currently controlling the money system and the government. So the way it's going to go, in my opinion, Alex, is that it's either going to get better or it's going to get worse, for sure. And it's not going to get better for everyone, and it's not going to get worse for everyone. So it's a complex question. Again, I want to reiterate to your point about, people, buying subscriptions and so on. It is really important that we support people either directly or indirectly, or become one of those people who are out there talking the truth to power. I think it's really important. So it is up to the actions of individuals. That is exactly, there's no inevitability in history as there is no inevitability in anyone's personal life. It is entirely based upon the choices you make and the commitments that you have. That having been said, I think that what's going to happen is pretty predictable, which is that the dependent classes are going to get the short end of the stick, to say the least, right? So the people who are retiring, the people who are dependent on welfare, the people who are dependent upon the government largesse, just as at the end of the Roman Empire, they get truly shafted. And what happens is the government, Obama and people are going to get on the TV and they're going to say, well, you know, this is a terrible situation. The bankers stole all the money. We as the government, we're just so helpless to do anything about it. And so what we have to do together is we have to get on a war footing with scarcity. So we have to, you know, all buckle down. We all have to share the pain. We're going to have to share accommodations. We're going to have to eat cat food. We're going to have to, you know, not have as much food for our pets. We're going to have to eye our goldfish with tartar sauce. We're going to have to do all of this pulling together. And this artificial war and togetherness is going to be created because of all the scarcity that is coming down the pipe for the people who are dependent upon state power.
I totally agree with you, by the way, and we see how this is premeditated because they've been preparing the green austerity and the rationing and training the younger people that it's really sexy, and so they're getting everyone prepared that it's cool to have austerity. I mean, if you go to Whole Foods, literally every time I'm in there every few months, half the magazines are how cool austerity is and how cool it is to lose your house and how bad it is to have money. Yeah, so they will also then be sicked on anybody who's been able to not be completely destroyed by this system.
Yeah, the fat will always teach the hungry that starvation is a virtue. That's how they sort of maintain themselves. And some people will fall for this and say, well, you know, we're now in a war against scarcity and we've all got to pull together. But some people will simply run out of patience and there will be the inevitable riots and there will be the inevitable blockades. I mean, up here in Canada, when they tried to reduce some of the farmers' payouts, you know, these subsidies for farming, which are so destructive to the world economy as a whole, and particularly to third world farmers who can't compete with free food dumped on their lands. They tried to cut the subsidies to the farmers. The farmers all took their tractors and drove at 3 miles an hour up and down the highways, you know, basically killing the entire economy. So there is going to be an escalation of resistance over time. There is going to be an escalation of violence. It's too late to prevent that, in my opinion. But what we can do is basically, once the gun comes out of the holster, it's going to be a lot more evident to people when we've been saying for years and years and decades, when we've been saying there's a gun in the room that you don't see. It's not a social contract. It's livestock. You are expendable. You are owned. You are harvested like a crop. It sounds nutty when people see Obama giving handshakes and being charismatic and presentable and wearing a suit and not fatigues. But when the guns come out, as they're going to come out when the dependent classes rise up against this scarcity, when the guns comes out, not only will people see the gun in the room that we've always been talking about, but the fact that we've always been talking about it and now it comes gives us a kind of credibility that can really help.
And by the way, they're already training us that when the gun comes out, it's for Al-Qaeda. But then when we get the internal documents, it's all about us. This whole grid is for all of us. We'll be right back.